We have to talk about the Romantasy book theft article that was just published in the New Yorker yesterday. It's called Did a Best-Selling Romantasy Novelist Steal Another Writer's Story by Katie Waldman. I highly recommend that you guys go read it. It is very well written and very interesting. I will not be posting screenshots. What I did do was take a lot of notes, so we're going to be in this together. Basically, this woman, Lynn Freeman, wrote this book called Blue Moon Rising in 2010. She based it off her personal experience of like growing up in Alaska. The main character is a gargoyle who grows up in Alaska. A lot of the book is written with this like reverence for nature, and she sells the book to this woman, Emily Sylvan Kim. They are not able to sell the book after 3 years of like trying to sell it together. They just like can't do it. In 2014, they break up. Cut to 2021, Lynn Freeman reads Crave by Tracy Wolff. She is startled by the like similarities to her story, right? In both books, the main character is orphaned and loses her entire family to an accident. In both books, she's raised by witches. In both books, she's like poisoned by a villain. In both books, she's kidnapped by an evil vampire. In both books, there's a scene under the Aurora Borealis. In both books, there's a scene where the main character is taken to this like palatial place made of marble with like beautiful candle sconces everywhere. So a lot of just like very, very, very little things that when put together add up to a big thing. She does some digging and she finds out that Tracy Wolff's agent is this woman, Emily Sylvan Kim. If the name sounds familiar, it is on the screen. It is because that was her original agent 10 years before. She decides to sue, and this is when it gets like a little bit crazy. On a specific part of Book Talk, there is this idea that books are marketed using hashtags, right? And because Book Talk has existed for the last 4 or 5 years, now publishers are specifically creating books to be marketed on Book Talk to like become sensations. Romantasy exploded in the last 4 years because of this, right? We are seeing the proliferation of hashtag focused content. So you get stuff like hashtag morally gray, hashtag subhuman, hashtag like werewolf bounty hunter, hashtag enemies to lovers, all of that stuff. The tropification of reading, which was something that Slate did an article on a couple of years ago that I was interviewed for. Reading about the lawsuit was interesting, but unfortunately, I am not a lawyer. Basically, the law protects the expression of ideas, but not the ideas themselves, right? So, like, all stories have a common core. You're not going to be able to, like, say, you can't write a book about a gargoyle and a vampire falling in love because I wrote it first. And then I have a quote of a sentence just because I thought it was a really good sentence. We're seeing the wild proliferation of intensely derivative romantasies. Because only a couple of romantasies become this popular and this successful, publishing is an industry that just like chases the dragon, right? They're not buying books that are already written about that stuff. They are going out to people and getting them to write these books in something called book packaging, where apparently they're saying, we will pay you a fee one time for you to write this book in the next like 6 weeks. Something that made me laugh was they brought up the Omegaverse lawsuit where this woman sued another woman for the creation of the Omegaverse. And if you don't know, you don't need to know. But if you know, you know. Amazon rewards authors that have a larger backlist, creating this weird thing where the publishers will now want authors to write faster and like put out books very quickly. We saw that with like Iron Flame and the sequel, Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, where it just like came out a year later and it was a disaster, right? There were misspellings. It just was not proofread. We're also seeing the reverse engineering of books where publishers will go out to certain people and say, we need a enemies to lovers hockey romance. Can you write this for us, right? And so the combination of these two things is creating this like massive glut of books just being written and written and written. It's sort of like a content farm, basically, where they know what's trending on Book Talk right now and they're writing to that. Holly Black, who's a famous romantasy author, said no one wants their book to be bad, but corners have to be cut somewhere. And unfortunately, we see where the corners are being cut. I loved this. Book blogger Jenny Trout said, authors are giving people what they want, but it's also like you're reading the same book over and over again. And then this is a quote, but go read the article. A paradox of romantasy novels is that they express the longing to be unique, but they pour that desire into imitative forms. Many of the genre's tropes are cliches about specialness. I think two separate things are happening here. I obviously am not a lawyer. I cannot speak to whether her book was stolen or not. It is suspicious that, it's the same agent. That's all I'm going to say on that. Thinking about it sociologically, hypercapitalism breeds hyperconsumption, which is a conversation that we've had on Book Talk a couple of times now. There are a lot of readers in like romance and romantasy who just like read the same thing over and over again. And they'll freely admit that, right? They'll say, I'll read any hockey romance. I'll read any enemies to lovers romance. I'll read any like marriage of convenience romance. And they'll just like do it because that's what they like. And these marketers and these publishers are like trying to fill this void because people need the content. And they're basically in their minds, there's money sitting on the table, why wouldn't they go after it? Sort of tying into this conversation that a lot of people are having about literature versus books, this influx of books that aren't like incredibly written just to like make more money on Amazon is like, the problem is that hypercapitalism creates this idea that like people affix their identities to what they're consuming, right? You could never criticize romantasy as a genre because all of the people are going to say, well, it's what I like. Why can't I just enjoy what I enjoy? I think the real issue, instead of creating capital A art, right, and like buying books that are interesting or new, or going to authors and like telling them we will pay you to write this very specific book because that's what's currently selling on Book Talk, is like kind of terrifying and kind of dystopian. I'm so sorry. I know that this app is the app of don't yuck anyone's yum, but it gets to a point. And I do think the issue that a lot of people in this article are talking around is that all of these books are very, very, very similar anyway. And like, yes, some are about dragons and some are about vampires and some are about gargoyles, but like once you drill down, there is sort of this like sheen of similarity.